But I'm delighted to launch, as I said, the first session of our big conversation, which is part of a sector-wide collaboration to think about what kind of governance do we need. And I think it's particularly important given the Commission on Governance, or the sector-initiated, sector-led review also around governance, in terms of what's appropriate and what's going to be the best kind of governance for HE, which makes it fit for the future. We're absolutely delighted to be partnering with AHUA, CUC, Guild HE, Universities UK, and Independent Higher Education. Their logo's not there because I think I don't know what's happened to it. It's coming, but it's not there at the moment. But they're very much a partner and valued partner as part of these discussions. I think why this is relevant is because wherever I go in the world and wherever I go in the country, and also because of the OFS interest, governance is becoming the #1 topic and issue. And today's conversation, as you know, is about the question of our governing bodies getting the right information they need to make both the longer term strategic decisions, but also deal with the immediate demands on the governing body. And underneath all of that is, are we getting the right stuff to measure what matters? Now, Advanced HE has done quite a bit of work on measuring what matters, and I think in the chat box there will be a link to that. But I'm very conscious we've only got an hour this morning, and I'm absolutely delighted that Alistair Jarvis is coming to join us this morning, fresh back from America. So we've got lots of fresh insights as well from there, to talk on behalf of AHUA. Aaron, as you know, is our lead associate director, one of our very highly regarded associates at Advanced HE, who's been doing governance work with us, I think, gosh, it must be over 10 years now. So we've got a great team here. We've also got a great team of facilitators from Advanced HE and AHUA who will be facilitating the breakout discussions. So over to you, Aaron and Alistair. Thank you very much, and let's have a great session.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Alison. Yes, it's a session really in two parts. I'm shortly going to have a short Q&A with Alistair Jarvis, and then we're going to hand over to you for some engagement to really throw this question out. As Alison mentioned, we want this to be the kickstart of a sector-wide conversation to assess where governance is across the sector, what's working well, but also what needs to perhaps improve. There is a lot of discussion and debate and a spotlight focused on governance, and it's a really opportune moment for us to seize that initiative, to be bold about what we think is working well, but I think honest about what we think needs to improve, and set a course of direction about what we want to do about that. Of course, it is really important to say that practice in governance varies across the sector. And we want also to flush that out in the conversation. If you've got things that you're doing in your institutions that you think is working really well and responds to the contemporary challenges, would be fantastic to hear that. And I hope you get a chance to share that in the breakout discussions and then in feedback. So what is it that we're going to focus on today? Well, today's session title is Our Governing Bodies Receiving the Right Information to Focus on Long-Term Strategy, as well as the immediate financial concerns, and also to measure what matters most. And so in those three areas, I think we've deliberately picked on things that when we are speaking, as we regularly do throughout the year, to chairs, to governors, to governance professionals, when we're undertaking board effectiveness, governance effectiveness reviews, these are three topics that come out with a degree of self-criticality about things that are done well, but things that can be improved. Do we focus enough on strategy, or has there been perhaps a necessary but extra assessment of where the sector is now and worrying about short-term issues, possibly to the cost of thinking about the long term? Do we present in the right way and in the right volume the sorts of information that boards need to undertake their scrutiny correctly? It will come as no surprise to you. The most common thing we hear in board effectiveness reviews is that we present the boards with too much information. What is in our control to do that a little bit better? And finally, are we measuring what matters? So I hope that sets the scene for what we're going to cover. And now I'm really delighted to be joined, you've already heard, by Alistair Jarvis, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Partnerships and Governance at the University of London. And I won't embarrass Alistair reading out his entire CV, but obviously has been a notable figure in the sector for a number of years. And as Alison mentioned, fresh back from a tour observing higher education over the other side of the Atlantic. So, Alistair, I thought I might kind of kick off with a general question. Over the course of the series of events that we're running, we're assessing the extent to which, in a changing higher education landscape, governance remains fit for purpose. And I wonder if you might kick off with an assessment of where governance is presently across the UK.
Thanks, Aaron, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I think making an assessment of governance in the broad sense is, is challenging. I think the majority of governance arrangements at the majority of universities are broadly fit for purpose. However, I think there's a number of salient issues that we should consider when you're making that kind of cross-sector assessment. I mean, firstly, it's really necessary, it's really important that universities regularly review and indeed evolve their governance arrangements. So just because governance arrangements were suitable and effective in the past doesn't mean that no change is needed. And the context changes, the issues change, and university governance also needs to adapt to meet new challenges. And of course, at this current time, with the significant pressures on the sector, you have to think, are the governance arrangements appropriate to steer universities through challenging times, making very difficult, significant, often financial decisions. So I think that first point is keep reviewing, keep evolving, and keep updating with some sort of view on the context. I think you've also got to recognise the very strong OFS interest in governance at this moment. And therefore, just saying everything's fine is probably not an appropriate answer. I also think that it is reasonable for the primary regulator to have an interest in good governance. I think we do have to think about what the role of the OFS is. What should regulators be doing in terms of governance? How can the OFS best play a supportive, effective role in improving governance? But I think there are concerns that the OFS has. There are examples of genuinely poor governance that needs addressing. And therefore, I think it is a legitimate interest, even if it is a challenging interest sort of for us. Then just sort of a final kind of general point, I think that there also really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach here or some right answer. And then again, so if you make an assessment of governance, diversity exists, differences exist, and that's correct because the sector is diverse and different, and therefore the governance arrangements to some degree also need to be. But there is really good practice. Good practice should be shared, should be celebrated. I think we can learn from each other. There are weaknesses that can be improved, but it's absolutely appropriate that different universities, different missions and scales have different governance arrangements.
I think that's a really helpful note on which to begin. And I think, as you say, that assessment of, there can't be a sort of blanket approach that works for everyone, but equally we can't be, defensive to say that everything's working fine, nothing to see here. Let's explore perhaps one of those tensions that exist, and it's something that we wrote about in a pre-event provocation. We'll share that in the chat and in the post-event email. And that was the tension, I think it's a fair word to describe it, between the focus on short-term issues, one of those prominently being financial sustainability that most governing bodies are having to grapple with right now, versus this issue of, is time, bandwidth, and energies being spent on sufficiently understanding and setting out long-term strategy, and a sense that possibly that there's a kind of either a cost or a trade-off between those two. And I wondered if you thought that was a fair assessment, where you thought the sector is, and how well they're navigating that balancing act.
So yes, I mean, I think this is one of the really hardest issues on which to get the balance right. And I think it's absolutely understandable, and indeed it's correct, that governing bodies do focus on significant short-term risks. There are short-term financial risks, there are regulatory compliance challenges, and therefore the short-term is a core part of the oversight. However, there's absolutely a risk that boards get really bogged down in the short-term challenges and therefore don't spend sufficient time on the longer-term strategic planning, horizon scanning, looking at longer-term big opportunities. I mean, everybody on this workshop will be acutely aware that since the creation of the OFS, there's been a real change in what university governing bodies are spending time on, and they're far more. There's far more regulatory items. There's far more things that have to go through the governing body, have to be signed off by the governing body, and therefore the time being spent on, I suppose, business as usual regulatory requirements is a very significant part of governing body agendas. So I think there's a real question of, how can this be done more efficiently, more effectively, whilst maintaining appropriate oversight? I mean, I absolutely don't have all the answers here, and this is something we are grappling with at the University of London. So I don't want to pretend I've got the answers, but I suppose I have got a few bits of advice or things to think about. I mean, ensuring that every board agenda allows time for discussion on longer-term strategic issues. So this is a sort of almost a basic planning thing. Make sure when you're scheduling your agendas, you block out time which isn't just on the business as usual regulatory compliance, but actually is about discussing future opportunities, monitoring of strategic plans. I mean, at the University of London, we're in the middle of developing a new strategic plan at the moment, and we just looked at our upcoming May board meeting, and we've decided to cut it in half. So the first half will be business as usual. Then we're going to deliberately take a break. We're going to break into smaller groups, and we're going to spend the second half specifically on strategy development. And that forces us not to have the whole agenda sort of soaked up. I mean, strategy away days that most people will do are a good part of that as well. I think there's also a question about informal discussions with board members outside the formal governance structures. I'm actually, if done appropriately, I'm a kind of big fan of this. I think, dinner discussions with boards, with external speakers on topical policy issues, on big sort of future opportunities, on horizon scanning. I think this kind of more informal contact can really help you think about some of those bigger issues without the sort of time constraints of a formal sort of board meeting. And similarly, a lot of universities will set up ad hoc informal advisory groups, and it's often quite a good way to draw on the sort of deep expertise, deep experience of independent members on some of those longer term strategic opportunities without getting yet into the formal kind of board discussions. So I think there are mechanisms you can use which give you a bit more time and space to talk about the big longer term strategic issues.
I think some of those quite sort of specific, you might even say sort of, tactical things, I think are really helpful, as you say, to strike the right balance. As you say, setting out some time just on every agenda to make sure there's at least a sufficient chunk of time to think about strategy. I know a lot of universities that, for instance, will do a deep dive through on a rotational basis through the pillars of their strategy. Sometimes the number of pillars in the strategy neatly lines up with the number of meetings across the year, and so across the full academic cycle, each of the pillars at least gets a bit of a deep dive. I'm also really struck by your comment around what can be done, in sort of full board mode, but how infrequently actually we use the time when the board is together to break off into smaller groups where certain discussions actually would benefit from being done in that way. And actually, some boards might want to go back, governors, chairs on this session today might go back and think, have we ever actually in a board meeting broken away from the full group? And there's also, I think, an interesting thing about who might contribute in slightly different ways when a board breaks out in that way. So really grateful for some of those sort of particular thoughts. I'm going to turn to a slightly different matter, still under the same umbrella. We're going to only touch on this one relatively briefly, and I should say that across the series of events that we've got over the next couple of months, we're going to go into this topic in more depth, but I think it is related to what we're talking about here today. So I'm interested in your view on this. So, you talked about the fact that we need to be constantly thinking about and evolving our approach as the circumstances for the sector change. But you might say that the structure and format of HE governance, governing bodies of around 20 people, meeting 4 or 5 times a year, largely under a volunteer model. That has remained constant, well, for some institutions over a matter of decades, actually. Possibly you could go further back than that in some instances. And I wondered whether you felt that that should be something that we are looking at, possibly changing, and if so, in what way?
Thanks, Aaron. You can hear there's a fire alarm going off in our building. There is always a test at 8:45. It should stop any moment now. I don't know if we want to just pause for a few seconds, or whether you want to say a little more just while it ends.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm happy to. I'll just fill for 20 seconds or so, and perhaps just add that I'd come from a earlier this week. I'm a chair of a university governing body and attended an OFS session. As Alison mentioned in the beginning, there is rightly a lot of focus on governance, and this is one of the issues that they really encouraged us as chairs to think about. And I have to say, there was a mood in the room around how the size of governing bodies can perhaps have an impact, both in terms of the way in which you can have discussions that everyone can feel freely able to participate in. There was also some interesting, and if I might say, not university shared views about the typical composition of our governing bodies, and what some of the advantages and disadvantages of having students and staff in the room. As I say, there was not a consensus on what those strengths and weaknesses were, but that came into the conversation around composition. So they may be things that you wanted to pick up, Alistair, but I'll hand back to you.
I'm afraid this alarm is more persistent than it normally is. It really should stop any moment now, but
it's not too loud.
No, Alistair, it's not that loud at all. We can hear you fine.
Can you hear me okay? Okay,
yeah,
thank you. So yes, I mean, so the size format of governing bodies. I mean, I'm a fan of smaller boards, but I think it's really hard to deliver this in the university context, given the expectations of majority of independent members, the breadth of issues that governing bodies need to cover. And of course, they need to have staff and students on boards as well. So I think actually, although I would rather see smaller boards, I think there are other ways to make governance more effective and efficient. At last, it stopped the fire alarm. I can hear myself think now. I think the focus just on the governing body is probably the wrong focus. So the governing body is one part of a much bigger governance structure. And I think if you're looking at making effective and efficient governance, you need to think about the subcommittees of the board, for example. So I certainly find there's often duplication. We certainly haven't got this right at the University of London, and actually we're currently grappling with this issue about, are you, do you have the right structure of board committees? Have you got lots of duplication? Have you got too many committees doing the same thing? Are you overly sort of burdening that? Are you creating too many papers, too much bureaucracy to make what should be more effective and efficient decisions? I think there's also a really important issue here about the exec and governance balance. Are there issues that the board is dealing with or a governance committee is dealing with that should really be being dealt with by the executive? Ultimately, there are a lot of issues that the board should really be providing assurance on or making major strategic decisions. And at times, I think governance structures actually almost encourage some governance input into what should be executive responsibilities. So I think getting that right is really important. I'll give you a couple of examples, and these may be mildly controversial, but does every university really need a health and safety committee? Or could that be part of, an audit and risk committee's responsibilities? Do you even need an estates committee? If you've got an expert estates team, there needs to be some oversight on major projects, but actually, do you need a whole committee sort of dedicated to that? So I think in general, rather than just focusing on the board, I would look at the wider governance structures. Although in an ideal world, I think, slightly smaller boards are not an unhelpful thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, and actually, I think where you've got to is similar to the mood of the room amongst a group of chairs, which is there is almost certainly a correlation between slightly smaller boards and more effective boards, but equally you can have small boards that don't don't operate that well, and large boards that actually can operate well. So it is more complex than just simply the number, even if there's an overall trend. And as you say, it's about deploying other things as well within our gift, about using the subcommittee structure in the right way, striking the right balance between what's governance and management, and so on, and in the way that you've described. And I mentioned at the top of my remarks, probably the most consistent piece of feedback that we get in board effectiveness reviews is that boards, governors in particular, receive too much information, that the papers are too dense, and that they don't really talk about the issues that matter most in as effective a way as possible. Do you agree with that? But probably you do. So why do you think that's the case? And perhaps more importantly, how do you think it can be remedied?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I think there's a tendency for a lot of executives to overshare detail, but actually undershare risks or undershare the sort of salient points. And you can often communicate something more effectively and more clearly with fewer words. I think, going back to a point I made earlier, I think getting the exec board balance right here is important. So there is certain levels and depths of information that on most issues at most of the time, the board do not need nor will find accessible a certain sort of level of depth of sort of information. I mean, I think there's some training, there's some basic guidance for paper authors that's always quite helpful here. Although a lot of papers going to governing bodies are sponsored typically by senior experienced people, often the experts who are actually writing the detailed drafting of the papers may not have had a lot of direct contact with board level readers. And I think some support and guidance for that is helpful. I think you probably all, everyone on this workshop will be doing this, but sort of really clear summaries of key points, RAG ratings where appropriate, clarity of what information is for decision or is for information, more strategic summaries, enhanced with dashboards, key performance indicators, visual aids like diagrams, anything you can use to try and kind of convey the information rather than just sort of reams and reams of plain text or sort of data tables. I mean, there really isn't a silver bullet here. I do worry that the sheer volume of information can leave governing bodies bogged down in sort of routine updates and regulatory compliance issues rather than engaging with some of the critical strategic issues. I think there is a really important thing here to consider the total volume of information as well, not just the sort of paper lengths. So it can be absolutely legitimate to have a long paper with lots of detail on certain issues at certain times. However, I think you've got to be very careful that your overall amount of information you're sharing, your overall paper length, your pack of meeting pack is not sort of unmanageable. You've got to be careful here not to starve the board of information as well. Some detail is needed on certain issues. So I don't think there's a sort of one size fits all. I'm absolutely not a fan of word or page limits or overly restrictive guidance. However, I think I would prioritize information that supports the identification of strategic risks, informs the responses to those risks, and if possible is summarized in a shorter way as possible. And you can, of course, as well have contacts for further information. So in fact, if the board members do not feel there's enough in the summary, you can offer contacts for further information.
That's all really, really helpful, and actually, I'm pleased to say that there's some commentary and thoughts going into the chat, and I'll particularly draw something out from Elizabeth Hill from City St George's, which I think is really salient to this point around there needing to be a shared understanding of what's the right information to put into the papers. There should be an ongoing dialogue across the executive, but also between the executive and the board about where is our board and where is our institution in terms of its what it's done previously in terms of the information it's given to the board, and actually, if there is a bit of a sense that we're overloading them, then actually, how is that being addressed? There may be, for some issues, as you say, a need for more information, and I have to say, it can sometimes be somewhat, alarming, actually, that when we probe as to why is it that the wrong degree of information has been given to the board, we hear things like, well, it was that the papers had to go out and we only received them, a couple of hours before they went out, and it's things like, well, what's your internal process then to actually quality assure the papers, and that ultimately the person in the university secretary, the kind of lead governance position, is then engaged with the executive to say, actually, we need some time and space before the papers go out to actually say, is this a pack that in its totality we think is emphasizing the right issues and speaks to what the needs are of our board? So I think that really just builds into what you were saying. A couple of quick two more questions before we go into breakout. So this is something that we've just touched on in passing, but engagement with key stakeholders, including staff and students, is usually incorporated through membership of the board. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that and possibly how that could be strengthened or evolved over time.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital that boards hear the voice of students and the voice of staff when making strategic decisions, and also that they have opportunities to meet with staff and students through the sort of course of the board's work. However, I'm not convinced that this is best done through increasing the size of the board or just having more and more staff and students on boards. I think things like survey data, focus groups, meetings with groups which have a more representative sample of the diversity of staff and students is often a better way than just packing your board full of more staff and students. I just give a sort of a specific example here. If you have a fantastic student on your board who happens to be a postgraduate commuter student, can they really reflect the views of an undergraduate residential international student? If you've got a brilliant senior experienced professor, do they really fully understand the perspective of a new junior member of your estate staff? So I think just having more staff and students is not the right answer. And the comparison I'd sort of make here is that if a university were to design a new degree program, you wouldn't just ask a few members of staff and students what they think about it. You would expect much deeper, wider views, greater evidence. That should also be the case when you're making strategic decisions at board level. So absolutely really important to have staff and student views, but it's got to be more than just having a feeble government body.
Yeah, and it can be one of those things that's most misunderstood. What are we expecting to come from our staff and our students? And as you say, to be very clear, they're obviously not representatives once they're around the board table. They are full and equal members. Yes, of course, they're informed by the particular perspective that they've, they might be a sabbatical officer or a recent student or a staff member in a particular bit of an institution, and that will naturally inform what they say. But as far as possible, actually, they're bringing other things as well to the board. I think there's an interesting conversation about whether election helps or hinders that, but also how other board members, I've seen so frequently, sometimes a chair, a vice chancellor, usually quite well-meaning, but swinging around and saying, to the student member, what do the students think of that? And I have to say, I think if it's a really important issue, the best thing that the student governor might say, actually, if it's a really important issue, how about we undertake some robust, comprehensive research in whatever, surveying focus groups to actually understand this issue. I can tell you what I think, but addressing that in a sufficient.
Aaron, I completely agree, and I think we've got to be careful not to conflate two issues here. I think the question was about the engagement with key stakeholders and ensuring that sort of staff and student voice was heard in decision making, which is really crucial. I think membership of the board of trustees or governing body, when a staff member or a student member joins the governing body, they are a member of that governing body, they are a full trustee, they are not a representative of students or of staff. And I think that's really important. I think it is important to get a representative view of students and staff, but that shouldn't be the role of the people on the governing body. There should be another channel for that information coming through.
Absolutely, we're very much as one on that. So, final question, just to finish off with before we go off into breakout discussions. Do you think boards really measure what matters most, and how can that be done as effectively as possible?
Yeah, well, in the joint blog that you and I did as a sort of provocation for this, we put in that sort of 3-step test to determine the relevance to the board, which, you know, is not a fail-safe test, but I think it's quite a nice starting point. It's, you know, does the information directly link to the institution's strategy? Does it address regulatory or statutory requirements? Does it materially affect the institution's value or reputation? And if the board paper or report doesn't meet one of those 3 criteria, you've got to really consider whether it should be included in the agenda. So I think when you're looking at measurement, lots of information, large quantities, doesn't necessarily help you. I think it has to be absolutely, there's a right measurement. I mean, I would like to see, you know, clear strategic KPIs, very clearly linked to the strategic objectives of the university. I think there's a role absolutely to, of course, regularly review these and build understanding of performance. I think there's a role here also for training of governors as well, to ensure that they understand the broader context and understand how to interpret certain information that is put in front of them. Benchmarking is really important here as well, I think. Your data information that allows benchmarking. There's also the question is, do the board actually know what matters to students, to funders, to regulators, to beneficiaries of research? So actually, are they measuring the right thing? And it's the responsibility, of course, of the executive through induction and training of governors to help guide that. But I think you know, just producing information is not the right thing. The information has to be useful and purposeful. So yes, that would be sort of what I'd say on measurement.
Terrific. Thanks, Alistair. And I've certainly, you know, enjoyed, you know, hearing your perspectives, some kind of issues of a sector overview, but also some quite practical and you know, specific things as well.